Well, I appreciate you all coming on the call today. And we're starting this call, as we did a couple of weeks ago, with a guest, someone who's had a big influence on the Solutionary Rail vision and the book. Actually, Ron's story is in the Solutionary Rail book. And Ron was one of the very first conversations when we were pondering what we as Backbone Campaign could do to quote unquote green Northern Corridor paper from 2008 that was given to us by Mike Elliott. So it's been important from the very start to understand the unique interests of rail labor and find out how we can be in solidarity with them and create a proposal that reflects their well-being as well as other stakeholders. So with that, I just like to also thank Ron for all the solidarity he's shown in this project, the collaborations around bringing railroad workers and environmentalists together through 2 conferences in 2015, and we look forward to more collaboration. So Ron, without more ado on that, could you speak to what you think are the most important things to be known by folks who maybe aren't familiar with the realities of railroad workers today?
Okay, thanks, Bill. This is Ron Kaminkow. I'm a locomotive engineer, currently working for Amtrak. Formerly worked for Norfolk Southern and Conrail prior to that. And I am the general secretary of an organization called Railroad Workers United. We are, in effect, a union in the maybe international sense of the term, but under U.S. labor law, we're not a union, and we do not pretend to be one in terms of holding contracts, bargaining, or quote-unquote officially representing railroad workers. We have 13 unions on the railroad, and Railroad Workers United is an attempt to build solidarity and unity between all of us in the different crafts represented by these different craft unions. And so I've been involved in that for about 10 years. I work out of Reno, but I'm formerly from Chicago. Grew up in Baltimore and hired out on the railroad about 20 years ago. And it's been a big part of my life, as you can imagine, ever since. And in many countries of the world, labor unions and organized labor doesn't play such a conservative role where we take a back seat to big business and simply bargain for the crumbs, the wages, benefits, better working conditions, and so forth, otherwise known as pure and simple trade unionism, sometimes called derogatorily business unionism. But those of a different vision of what organized labor can be, so that we are not simply content allowing the corporations to determine our destiny and then, in effect, every 3 or 4 or 5 years go to the bargaining table and say, hey, we want ours, Jack. You know, we want wage increases and a piece of the pie. We want more than that. And in fact, it's not even just a tactical question. It's actually a strategic, ideological worldview. And I believe we can't succeed as organized labor. And I think history has shown for the last 50 years that we're not succeeding as organized labor as long as we pursue this very pure and simple trade unionist path, because the corporations own the planet and they are going to determine largely what's done with it. And if all we do is sit there and say we want better wages, benefits, and working conditions, that's not going to be very helpful to us. 1, if we don't have jobs, because we're all automated out of existence. And 2, if we don't have a planet at all to live on. And so I'm very, very interested in seeing workers and their organizations take a front and center role in the future of the economy and society in general. And that's going to be a huge about face and a huge change for existing organizations, particularly railroad unions, which have been around for, in some cases, over 150 years. They're some of the oldest, and by my experience, some of the most conservative labor organizations in the country. It's ironic because we actually have a very, very militant and progressive history going back in some ways in terms of our ability to foment strikes. And for example, in 1877, it was railroad workers that led the first general strike in this country, which was actually coast to coast. But here we are today in a situation where there's less than 200,000 railroad workers in the United States. We used to have 2 million, and we are still divided up. We used to have 26 different unions. Many of those have either passed out of existence or have amalgamated, and so we still have 13 unions. And if you do the math, you'll see that there's very few of us in each of those unions, and we're scattered across 48 states, basically. So we're paper thin, but we have immense power. And the reason we have such immense power is because we have the ability to, in effect, shut the country down if we ever took a notion to do such a thing. There's all sorts of laws and restrictions under the Railway Labor Act that would prevent us from doing such a thing, but there used to also be laws against sitting at lunch counters if you had the wrong color of skin. So what the future holds for rail labor is unclear, but our numbers are rapidly diminishing. You may have heard of Hunter Harrison and his latest exploits on the Canadian Pacific Railway. He came from Canadian National, where he gained fame as somebody who could make lots and lots of money for lots and lots of stockholders by basically getting rid of lots and lots of workers. I mean, that's the key. And so we face a very uncertain future. Hunter may soon become CEO of the third biggest railroad in the country, the CSX, and do a hatchet job on the workforce there. So anyway, how this all ties into Solutionary Rail is we need to go on the offensive as railroad workers. We can no longer sit back, not that we ever could, and expect our fortunes to be taken care of by stockholders and CEOs and be content with the pure and simple trade unionist model. We have to become more proactive and actively intervene in our future. So how to do that? We're a small group, like I say, probably about 175,000 or so unionized workers. We actually are the most unionized sector in American society by far at this point, although that may not last, but that's another whole story given the potential for a national right to work law that would include the Railway Labor Act. And so we could see our ranks decimated here shortly, but we'll save that for another conversation. Right now, we've got about 175,000 dues-paying union workers, and we can't adequately defend ourselves. So when I met Bill, probably 3 years or so ago, we started to consider the question of railroad safety as something we could organize around that would bring environmentalists, community activists, and railroad workers all into the same boat. Because we are, if an oil train is running through your community and derails and kills the engineer and the conductor, blows up and wipes out half your neighborhood like it did in Lac-Mégantic, Canada, it's a concern of all of us, especially the 20 million or so people living within the blast zone of a derailed oil train. So we did a series of conferences. The Backbone Campaign and Railroad Workers United participated along with 30 or 40 other unions, environmental groups, community organizations, and so forth. And so that is kind of our connection to the whole question of not just Solutionary Rail, but the whole question of building a society, in particular building a transportation system, in particular building a railroad network that meets the needs of people more than just meeting the needs of the fossil fuel industry and corporations in general. One that is more efficient, one that employs more workers, one that takes the traffic of freight especially, but also passengers off of other more inefficient modes of transport. China, which is leading the way, and also the European countries who have done amazing things with trains in the last half century, and start thinking more and more in terms of how we can work with community organizations, others who are not railroad workers, to build this kind of movement that is necessary to achieve our mutual goals. Cleaner air, cleaner water, more efficient transportation, getting away from fossil fuel usage, less congested highways. In fact, the idea of building any more highways in this day and age is absurd. You know, we should be thinking about double tracking and triple tracking and electrifying railroads. And of course, to win our rank and file, which is often very cynical, in many cases very conservative, over to this vision, we need to talk about expanding the railroad and looking at its potential, not just as a hauler of 30-mile-an-hour coal trains for 2,000 miles, but as a hauler of expedited perishable freight, passengers, parcels, recapturing high priority single packages, less than carload traffic, single carload traffic. All of these things the railroad used to do and do extremely well, we can do it once again. And not only will we save our jobs, but we can expand the rail industry, provide more jobs, good paying union jobs, by hauling things that aren't necessarily detrimental to the environment. And it's a tough sell at times. And we've lost members and we've had people not be too happy with us, but it's a struggle, and it's a one-on-one educational process to teach people that we could have a politics of a just transition being one where we transform from a fossil fuel, dirty energy-based economy to one that is based on renewables and clean energy. But the working class, blue-collar workers in particular, are not forced to pay the penalty by seeing our communities dry up and blow away, seeing our jobs disappear, and being forced onto unemployment or welfare or working at fast food restaurants and so forth for minimum wage. Because if that's the alternative, we'll never convince working people to go along with the new environmentally sound economy. So it's a tough sell. We're working on it. We're doing our best. Hopefully some of our folks are buying the Solutionary Rail book, if nothing else, to expand their horizons, expand their mind as to what is possible and where we possibly could go in the future, as opposed to just, once again, bargaining for better wages, benefits, and working conditions, while the stockholders and the CEOs and the board of directors make all of these earth-shaking decisions that we have no say in our futures.
Ron, could you speak a little bit to the pressures on railroad workers, the diminishing crew sizes, and a little bit to the history of that? As one of the public benefit mandates mentioned in Solutionary Rail is the guaranteed minimum crew size of 2 people.
Yeah, the rail carriers since 2004 have been pushing for single employee operation of trains. In fact, our organization came out of the struggle against that. To date, we have been pretty successful, but the wolf is at the door, and we have been able to ward off the single employee crew phenomenon here for well over a decade, but our backs are getting more and more up against the wall.
Why is it so important to have more than one crew person? And are there any lessons from places that have reduced their crew sizes to 1?
Well, I mean, for us, it's overwhelmingly important. And even though you'll hear stories about, well, in Europe, they run these freight trains and they only have a single operator. While this might be true, it's a different animal in the United States completely. We're not talking about small unit trains of 1,000 tons that are traveling 100 miles. In the United States, freight trains run for hundreds, if not thousands of miles. We have tens of thousands of unprotected railroad crossings. Each year we hit literally hundreds, if not thousands, of vehicles and pedestrians. We have endless fatalities at these numerous crossings, both protected and unprotected, around the country. And our trains weigh in anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15,000 tons. The railroad industry is continually pushing and working and lobbying for ever longer and heavier trains. 2 miles long is not unusual any longer. And having a single operator on a train of this nature when something goes wrong, which is very, very often, and often in very isolated areas, it's simply not a good idea. I could go into way, way, way more of this. All of it's on our website. If anybody ever wants to look at our stuff, www.railroadworkers.org. You can learn all about the single employee crew issue and about 5 or 10 other of our important safety-oriented campaigns.
One of the pieces that has been real instructive for us is the issue of chronic fatigue.
Take your train to your away-from-home terminal where you will lay over for an unknown amount of time, and then you will get a train at some point, you don't know when, and it will bring you back to your home terminal, and then you'll have possibly as little as 10 hours off duty before you go back and do it again. So it makes it impossible to plan other activities of daily life, relationships, family, hobbies, interests, sleep, etc., etc. So we are in a constant state of fatigue. And fatigue has been equated with being inebriated. And ironically, on the railroad, there is zero tolerance for alcohol consumption and abuse, but yet numerous psychological studies show that the effects of fatigue are very, very similar to those of being under the influence of alcohol, and yet we all go to work fatigued. The railroad knows it, the government knows it, the industry is very aware of it. To this day, no railroad has ever uttered the word fatigue. They deny that it exists. We just had a head-on collision in Hoxie, Arkansas, 2.5 years ago. The National Transportation Safety Board just ruled that fatigue played a major role in that train wreck. If you all watch the news and keep up with train wrecks like I do, you'll notice that lots of train wrecks the National Transportation Safety Board says are accountable to fatigue, but the industry denies it and does very little about it. And why do they do that? Because they want to run as many trains as possible with as few employees as possible. And so this is the system that has evolved.
Ron, would it be accurate to say that the experience of whistleblower retaliation and the reluctance of workers who are injured on the job, potentially due to fatigue, may be because of the inability of the railroad industry to create a system that doesn't have fatigue as an essential part of the equation because of the current business model of lack of schedules and just waiting for trains to fill up, and so they have to just be in a state of denial?
Well, and for those of you that aren't aware of what Bill's talking about as far as whistleblowers, there's like the 19 whistleblower laws in this country to ostensibly designed to protect workers if you report a workplace injury or report a workplace hazard and the company that you work for takes reprisal against you. And so we have hundreds of railroad worker whistleblowers since our law was passed less than about 8 years ago now, I believe. And the railroad industry appeals every single case. We've won hundreds of them at the OSHA level with full penalty levied against the employer, but the rail carrier in every single case, barring none that I've ever heard of, appeals it, and so it goes into the court system at that point. It's an insidious system, but what is phenomenal is the number of whistleblowers from the rail industry. It's all out of proportion to every other industry. And I should mention, Bill, at this point that we work under a law called FELA, the Federal Employers Liability Act. And this is legislation that came in, I believe, in the 20s or 30s. And what it does is it provides a uniform code. The rail employers actually supported it at the time because you had a patchwork of different states. Apparently all had different regulations. And so the rail carriers were actually in favor of a national system. They knew they were beat. However, they would prefer to see no FELA whatsoever because we sue our employer. We do not have workers' comp. So if I went to work tomorrow and got my leg cut off and I could easily show that it was the fault of the employer not providing a safe workplace, then they would be indebted to me for millions of dollars. And so there's this insidious system of quote unquote safety on the railroad, and they want to shift the blame for all accidents and injuries onto us. It's a process that actually has a name. It's called behavior-based safety. The railroads contract with vendors who sell this service, and they spend millions of dollars on quote-unquote safety programs where instead of pinpointing hazards, they're more interested in your behavior. And why are they interested in your behavior? Because then they can lay all the blame on you when there's a head-on collision, or, for example, in Lac-Mégantic right now, where the train ran away and destroyed half the town. The simple answer is the engineer didn't set enough handbrakes. And so that's behavior-based safety in a nutshell right there. When in fact, that train was staffed by a single employee crew. That train did not set air brakes as policy, which is an insane idea that George Westinghouse invented the air brake in the 1890s, and that train was fully equipped with air brakes. But by policy, that rail carrier ordered its crews not to set the automatic brake. Why? because in cold weather, the brake valves have a tendency they can possibly freeze up. The brakes wouldn't release properly. And with a single employee crew, it's impossible basically to inspect the train and deal with the question of stuck brake valves. And so, like Mechanic's another whole story, but it's very emblematic of what's wrong, excuse me, with the rail industry in terms of its focus on worker behavior rather than structures, institutions, policies, procedures, programs, and so forth at the more macro level. And so we don't see the forest for the trees. We're so busy watching the worker, doing observations on his or her behavior. Are they walking properly? Are they using the eyes on path and so forth, that you can't even see a safety hazard that's glaring right in front of your face. It all fits together with this insidious drive by the rail carriers to A, get rid of workers, B, make them superfluous, and C, serve the stockholders.
And also, and part of that is just running trains without a schedule and not allowing workers to have a schedule with a humane amount of rest built into their life. Are there any of the folks on the call who have a question for Ron?
I have some brief questions. This is Scott Woodinville. Yeah.
Thanks, Scott.
I wondered about, our experience in the United States, railroads regards to the European model. And I just wonder what you have to say about that. I realize that we need strong unions to compare to anything, I think, in Europe. But have you looked at that and seen, what their programs look like and their jobs, and how's that work? What are they doing there with the number of crews on trains and so on?
All right, thanks. Big question. In England right now, where we have some contacts and exchanges, they are moving more and more towards single employee crew operations on some passenger trains, particularly on the Southern Railroad down by London. And the union has fought back. Now, I'm not sure what the state of that struggle is. As far as the European rail system, it has evolved so completely differently than the system in the United States. Largely, the railroads were nationalized in Europe either before the war, the Second World War, or immediately afterwards. And European countries being much smaller in size than the United States, higher population density has things to do with it as well. But they had the ability to put in public funds. Railroaders sometimes will go over to Germany and they come back and they can't believe it. I mean, they're like, oh my God, this is amazing, or anybody goes over to Europe and takes a train ride and they're just blown away. And it's like, well, it didn't come free. The governments of Germany and Spain and France pumped in tens of billions of dollars to make those systems happen. The United States, totally different experience. The railroads in this country have predominantly always been owned by private industry to this day. And they own the tracks, they own the property, they own the locomotives, and they call the shots. They've been regulated to one extent or another, but basically they have operated in the interest of their stockholders and not in the interest of society, and they have had a different experience altogether. It's a completely different system. I mean, it can be argued that the United States railroad system is the greatest system in the world in terms of, even after abandoning half the track, we still have a huge amount of track for the geographical size of this country. It's in immaculate shape compared to what it was in 30 years ago, and it can move trains that very few places in the world can move in terms of tonnage and size, because the rail and the ties and the ballast and the basic track structure is immaculate. It is built, designed to handle 20,000 ton coal trains and going very slow oftentimes. But that's been the model that's developed in this country. Whereas if you were to go to Austria or Germany or what have you, the majority of the freight trains there are going to be probably 20 to 30 cars, perhaps. They will be short and fast. They will start at point A. They will stop at point B. They don't run very much different than a passenger train in that sense. It's a completely different world. and the track structure is much lighter there because they don't run these. If you look at their freight cars, for the most part, I mean, they're still put together in a way that we would have done in this country 100 years ago, let's say. You know, the mechanical material necessary to haul such light tonnage. So it's a different ball game altogether.
Has the idea of partnering with USPS been involved, just in terms of trying to advance the idea? And you know, the USPS is one of the biggest unions in the country.
You're speaking of the Postal Service, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, the Postal Workers Union, like ours, they have 5, 6 different unions, and they are in a coalition, and they have created this thing called a Grand Alliance that some of you might be aware of, to save our postal system. And Railroad Workers United has signed on and endorsed. We're one of the list of organizations that has endorsed their struggle. It's a fascinating question. The Postal Service used to be a huge customer of U.S. railroads. And by the late 60s, they not only were no longer sorting mail on trains, but they weren't hardly shipping mail on trains. UPS ships lots of stuff by rail now. FedEx less so, but there are these package haulers that are using the railroads, and there really is no reason for the Postal Service to not use the railroad that I can see, and it would be a boon for both of us, and that would be a very interesting avenue for RWU to explore with the Postal Workers Unions to see if we can start to lobby and push for, you know, returning some of that mail and parcel service to the rails.
Well, that would certainly be a boon also for Solutionary Rail in order to argue for faster, more regular service. Ron Kaminkow.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be a great alliance. So I just want to say thank you again. I remember our very first conversation, and it was that conversation that really inspired Solutionary Rail to reach out and go forward and take this challenge that we got from Mike Elliott seriously. It was clear that we had a potentially deep alliance and movement building opportunity to work with RWU, Railroad Workers United, and your leadership and the other great people in that organization made that clear from the start. So thank you again for all of your collaboration thus far, and we look forward to much more going forward.
All right. Thanks, Bill.